a dynasty always looks unshakable from the outside, until a single honest comment starts the tremor. For nearly 4 decades, Geno Auriemma has built UConn Huskies women's basketball into the gold standard of college dominance. National titles, Olympians, WNBA stars. A culture of precision so exact that mistakes feel like betrayal. Inside the program, pressure isn't a buzzword, it's the oxygen players breathe. But this week, a few measured words from freshman standout Sarah Strong quietly pulled back the curtain. No accusations, no drama, no headlines, at least not yet, just honesty. And that's what made it loud. Strong spoke about the expectations inside the locker room, the constant demand to be flawless, the mental load of representing a program where winning is not a goal but a requirement. She didn't criticize Auriemma. She didn't complain. She simply described what it feels like to be inside the machine. For WNBA scouts, former Huskies, and insiders around the women's game, the comments landed with surprising weight. Because this isn't the first time whispers have circled the program about the emotional toll behind the banners. It's just the first time the words came from a player still wearing the jersey. The timing matters. The landscape of women's basketball is shifting. Transfer portal freedom, player empowerment, a new generation that values mental wellness as much as minutes played. And suddenly, the old-school intensity that once defined greatness is being re-examined under a modern lens. Is it toughness, or is it too much? Is it the reason UConn wins, or the reason some players quietly struggle? Strong didn't intend to spark a debate, but she may have ignited one anyway. Because when a freshman speaks candidly about pressure inside the most iconic program in the sport, the rest of the basketball world listens, especially the WNBA, where many former Huskies now reflect on what it really took to survive before they ever turned pro. The clip didn't go viral because it was loud. It went viral because it was quiet. No raised voices, no dramatic music, no headline-grabbing quote meant to stir controversy. Just Sarah Strong speaking calmly, almost thoughtfully, about what it feels like to walk into the gym every day wearing a UConn Huskies women's basketball jersey. And somehow, that calm honesty shook the women's basketball world louder than any scandal ever could. People replayed the clip again and again, not because of what she said at first, but because of what it revealed the more you listened. The pauses, the careful wording, the way she chose her phrases like someone navigating a minefield without wanting to step on anything that might explode later. She talked about expectations. She talked about standards. She talked about how every drill, every possession, every mistake gets magnified inside a program that doesn't just want to win, it expects perfection. And if you followed Geno Auriemma for even a season, you know that perfection is not a metaphor in stores. It's the baseline. For decades, players have described it as the most demanding environment in college basketball, not physically. Mentally, you don't just practice. You're evaluated. You don't just play. You're measured. You don't just compete. You're compared to legends whose jerseys hang in the rafters and whose WNBA careers are now proof of what surviving UConn can produce. And that's where Strong's words hit differently for people who know the history. Because former Huskies have hinted at this before, years after they left. In podcasts, in interviews, in passing comments that only made sense if you read between the lines. They would laugh about how hard it was. They'd say things like, "Geno gets on you," or "You have to be mentally tough to play there," with a smile that didn't always reach their eyes. But those were reflections from the other side. This was different. This was someone still inside the system, still wearing the jersey, still showing up to practice the next morning. That's what made it feel raw. WNBA scouts noticed. Former players noticed. Coaches around the country noticed. And fans, especially the new wave of women's basketball followers who care as much about player wellness as they do about box scores, noticed something that older generations may have brushed off. The game is changing. The players are changing. And the culture that once defined dominance is being looked at through a new lens. For years, UConn Huskies women's basketball was the dream destination, the place where 5-star recruits went to become pros, the place where discipline forged champions, the place where Geno Auriemma turned teenagers into legends. But now, with nil deals, transfer freedom, and players empowered to choose environments that fit their mental and emotional needs, The question quietly hanging in the air is no longer just, can you handle UConn? It's should you have to. Strong never asked that question out loud. But her description of the daily reality inside the program made people start asking it themselves. She spoke about how every mistake is addressed immediately, how there's no room to hide, how even the smallest details are corrected, sometimes bluntly, sometimes publicly. How you have to develop thick skin fast because there is no time for softness when banners are the standard. For older basketball minds, this sounded like coaching. Normal, necessary, the reason UConn is UConn. For younger fans, it sounded like something else. Pressure that doesn't turn off. A spotlight that never dims. A mental weight that follows you from the court to the dorm room and back again. And suddenly, clips of Auriemma coaching on the sideline, the fiery corrections, the animated frustration, the relentless intensity, started circulating again online. But this time with a different tone in the comments. Not admiration, analysis. People weren't asking, is this why they win? They were asking, what does this feel like to live through every day? Because Strong's calm explanation made it real. She described the feeling of knowing that you're being compared not just to your teammates, but to the history of the program. That every possession carries the weight of the past. That you're expected to live up to names you grew up watching on TV, now hanging above you in the gym. That's a kind of pressure you can't train for. You can train for conditioning. You can train for shooting. You can't train for the psychological weight of legacy. And for WNBA insiders, that part rang the loudest. Because many former Huskies have spoken about how the WNBA felt easier mentally than college. Less pressure, more freedom, more autonomy. And at the time, it sounded like a compliment to Auriemma's preparation. Now, people are wondering if it was also an unintentional confession. What if the reason UConn players seem pro-ready isn't just skill? What if it's survival? Strong didn't say any of this directly. She didn't criticize. She didn't complain. She spoke with respect. But the honesty in her description allowed listeners to connect dots that had been scattered across years of interviews, stories, and sideline moments. And then came the part that really made the clip spread. She mentioned how you learn quickly that there's no such thing as an off day mentally. That you have to be locked in all the time because the standard never lowers. That even when you're exhausted, you can't show it. That sentence hit like a brick. Because in 2026, in a sports world where mental health is part of every conversation, the idea that a player feels they can't show exhaustion felt outdated, almost alarming. And yet, to longtime followers of the program, it sounded completely on brand. That's when the debate started. Is this elite coaching, or is this an environment that only a certain type of player can emotionally withstand? Recruiting experts began quietly discussing how many top prospects now prioritize fit over legacy. How some players choose programs where they feel supported rather than tested. How the new generation doesn't romanticize suffering the way older athletes once did. And that's where this becomes bigger than one interview. Because if UConn's model is built on relentless mental demand, and the next generation of stars is less willing to accept that cost, what happens to the dynasty model? For the first time in years, people aren't just analyzing UConn's roster, they're analyzing its culture. And it all traces back to a freshman who simply answered a question honestly. No drama, no accusations, just reality. The kind of reality that, once heard, can't be unheard. Former players have stayed mostly quiet publicly, but the private conversations are reportedly louder than ever. Some defend Auriemma's methods as the reason they became who they are. Others admit that the experience was harder than they let on at the time. Because here's the truth no one says out loud. Winning hides a lot. As long as banners go up, the process rarely gets questioned. But when the conversation shifts from did it work to what did it cost, that's when things get uncomfortable. Strong didn't intend to pull the curtain back. She just described what it feels like to stand behind it. And now, the rest of the basketball world is looking through the opening she accidentally created, trying to decide what they see. And once people started looking through that opening, they couldn't stop noticing things that had always been there. Old press conferences resurfaced. Sideline clips made the rounds again. Practice footage, interviews, mic'd up segments, moments that once felt like proof of intensity were now being rewatched with a different question in mind. What does this feel like for the player on the receiving end? Because intensity looks very different depending on where you're standing. To the audience, it's passion, standards, championship DNA. To the player, it can feel like living inside a microscope. That's the part that hit hardest for those who listened carefully to Sarah Strong. She wasn't describing a moment. She was describing a constant state, a mental environment that never really powers down. And once that idea settled in, people started connecting it to stories that had floated around women's basketball for years, but were never stitched together. Why some highly ranked recruits quietly decommitted in the past. Why certain transfers never fully explained their decisions. Why a handful of former players, long after graduating from the UConn Huskies women's basketball, described their college years as the hardest thing I've ever done, with a laugh that carried more weight than humor. At the time, those comments felt like badges of honor. Now, they feel like clues. The shift isn't happening because anyone accused Geno Auriemma of wrongdoing. It's happening because the definition of what athletes are willing to endure for greatness is evolving in real time. What was once accepted as the price of excellence is now being examined as a potential cost too high for some. And that's where this becomes uncomfortable for people who grew up admiring the UConn model. Because if you believe Auriemma built the greatest program in women's college basketball history through relentless accountability, then questioning the emotional toll feels almost like questioning the banners themselves. But younger fans and players don't see it that way. They're asking a different question. Can you build greatness without that level of psychological strain? And if the answer is yes, then the old way starts to look less like necessity and more like tradition. Strong's words didn't accuse. They didn't dramatize. They simply made the day-to-day feel visible. She described how even in practice, there's an awareness that mistakes aren't just corrected, they're remembered. That you carry them with you into the next drill, the next possession, the next film session. That kind of memory builds discipline. It also builds pressure that lingers long after the whistle blows. For WNBA evaluators, this revelation landed in a fascinating way. For years, they've praised UConn players for being mentally tough, coachable, prepared for anything. Now, some are privately wondering whether that readiness comes from refinement or from enduring a system that forces you to adapt or break. Because there's a difference. And it's a difference that's rarely talked about in public. Several former Huskies who now play professionally have, over time, hinted that the pros felt liberating. Not easier physically, but lighter mentally, more collaborative, less fear of mistakes. At the time, it sounded like appreciation for professional culture. Now, it sounds like contrast. And that contrast is what's driving the conversation into places it has never gone before. The rise of player empowerment has changed how stories like this are received. 10 years ago, Strong's comments might have been brushed off as welcome to big-time basketball. Today, they spark threads, debates, and deep dives into coaching philosophy across the sport. Is constant correction motivating, or does it slowly erode confidence for players who don't thrive under that style? Is public accountability building character, or creating an environment where players feel they must be perfect to be accepted? These aren't easy questions, especially when asked about a program that has produced legends and changed the trajectory of women's basketball forever. But they're being asked now, quietly by recruits, loudly by fans, carefully by insiders, because Strong's calm explanation made something intangible feel tangible. It gave people language for something they'd sensed but never quite articulated. The idea that playing at UConn might require not just talent and work ethic, but a very specific emotional makeup. A tolerance for constant scrutiny. An ability to absorb criticism daily without internalizing it. A willingness to live under standards that never bend. That's not something you can measure on a scouting report, but it might be the most important trait of all for surviving there. And that realization is starting to ripple into recruiting conversations in ways no one expected. High school stars now have more options than ever. Nil opportunities, immediate playing time elsewhere, coaches who sell development through encouragement rather than correction. And when families sit down to discuss where a young player will spend the most formative years of her life, the conversation is changing from where will she win to where will she thrive. That subtle difference matters, because thriving and surviving are not the same thing. Strong didn't say she was struggling. She didn't say she was unhappy. But the way she described adapting, learning quickly, growing thicker skin, adjusting to the tone and pace of communication, sounded less like a dream and more like an initiation. An initiation into a culture that has worked for decades, but now faces a generation less willing to equate hardship with honor. And that's why this moment feels bigger than a single interview clip. It's a cultural checkpoint for women's basketball. A moment where the sport pauses and asks whether the blueprint that built the past is the blueprint that fits the future. Because here's the part no one wants to admit out loud. If even a small percentage of elite recruits decide that the emotional demands of UConn aren't worth it, the ripple effect could be massive. Dynasties don't fall apart loudly. They erode quietly, one decision at a time. One recruit choosing differently. One player transferring earlier. One family prioritizing environment over legacy. And none of that requires scandal, just awareness. Strong didn't create awareness intentionally, but she may have accelerated it. And now, people are looking at Auriemma not just as a legendary coach, but as the architect of a system that might be facing its first true generational challenge. Not from opponents, from evolution, because the modern athlete wants accountability and support, discipline and empathy, high standards and emotional safety. And the programs that figure out how to balance all three may define the next era of dominance. The question quietly forming is whether UConn's culture can adapt without losing the edge that made it famous, or whether that edge is inseparable from the pressure Strong described. That's the tension sitting at the center of this conversation, and it's why this topic has spread so quickly without anyone shouting. It feels important. It feels overdue. It feels like something that has always existed in the background, finally stepping into the light because one freshman answered a question with honesty instead of rehearsed praise. And now, everyone is listening differently, not just to Strong, but to every former Husky who speaks from this point forward, not just to Auriemma's sideline intensity, but to the faces of the players receiving it. Because once you start asking how something feels instead of how it looks, you can't go back to watching the same way again. And once you start watching faces instead of scoreboards, a different story begins to surface. Not a story about wins and losses, not a story about banners and trophies, a story about expressions in timeouts, body language in huddles, the split-second reactions after a missed rotation, a late pass, a defensive lapse. Moments that used to blur into the intensity of competition now stand out with uncomfortable clarity. Because people aren't just hearing Sarah Strong anymore. They're seeing what she described. They're watching old games from the UConn Huskies women's basketball and noticing how quickly players look toward the sideline after mistakes. How some shoulders tighten before walking to the bench. How often corrections happen in real time, in full view, with a tone that has always been part of the program's identity. For years, that tone was interpreted as passion. Fire, the standard of excellence set by Geno Auriemma. Now, that same tone is being reinterpreted through a different emotional lens. And this is where the conversation becomes truly mind-bending for longtime fans, because nothing about the behavior has changed, only the way it's being understood. That's what makes this moment so powerful. No new scandal, no leaked stories, no dramatic accusations, just a shift in perspective that makes decades of footage feel like it's being viewed for the first time. People are realizing that what looked like discipline from the outside may have felt like constant evaluation from the inside. And that realization is spreading far beyond one program. Coaches across women's college basketball are paying attention to this conversation closely, not because they feel targeted, but because they recognize themselves in it. The old-school model of coaching, loud corrections, relentless standards, public accountability, has been normalized for generations. But the athletes have changed faster than the coaching culture has. That's the uncomfortable truth humming beneath this entire discussion. Strong didn't say UConn is unique in this. She described it in a way that made people realize how common this style might be at the highest levels, and how rarely players have been asked how it feels to live inside it. Because for decades, the assumption was simple. If it produces winners, it must be right. Now the question is, right for what? Right for banners, or right for people? And that's where former players start to enter the picture in a way no one expected. Not with statements, not with interviews, but with silence that suddenly feels louder than words. Fans have started revisiting old podcasts, old quotes, old interviews from past Huskies now in the WNBA, and hearing subtext that didn't register before. Comments about relief, about freedom, about learning to trust themselves again. At the time, those comments sounded like normal post-college reflections. Now, they sound like pieces of a puzzle Strong unknowingly helped complete. It's not that anyone is saying UConn is harmful. It's that people are starting to acknowledge it might be emotionally harder than anyone ever openly admitted. And that distinction matters, because difficulty has always been glorified in sports. But emotional strain is something this generation is no longer willing to romanticize. Recruiting analysts have started whispering about it in private circles. The idea that some five-star prospects love UConn's history, but hesitate when they learn what daily life inside the program actually feels like. That parents ask different questions now than they did 10 years ago. Not just about playing time and development, but about communication style, emotional support, and mental wellness. And here's the part that really shifts the narrative. For the first time, UConn's culture is being discussed not as a guaranteed advantage, but as a specific fit. That's new, because for decades, the assumption was that if you were good enough to be recruited by Auriemma, you were lucky. Period. Now, players are asking if they are wired for it, if they want it, if they need it. And that subtle shift in power, from program choosing player to player choosing program, is what makes this moment feel historic. Strong's honesty didn't create this change. It exposed that the change was already happening quietly. It gave language to something recruits were already feeling, but hadn't seen described publicly by someone inside the machine. And once that language exists, it spreads fast. Social media amplified it. Former athletes from other programs chimed in indirectly, sharing their own stories about pressure, expectations, and mental fatigue. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't just about UConn anymore. It was about the culture of elite women's basketball as a whole. But UConn sits at the center of it because UConn is the model everyone copied, which means questioning UConn's approach feels like questioning the foundation of the sport's modern success. That's why this feels so big, because it's not loud, it's reflective. People are thinking instead of arguing, listening instead of shouting, and that's far more powerful. You can almost feel the generational line being drawn in real time. Older fans saying, "This is what greatness requires." Younger fans saying, "Maybe greatness doesn't have to feel like that." Neither side is wrong, but the tension between them is impossible to ignore now. Auriemma hasn't changed. His standards haven't softened. His approach hasn't shifted. And for many, that consistency is exactly why he's legendary. But consistency in a changing world can suddenly start to look like resistance instead of reliability. And that's the uncomfortable position this conversation has placed him in. Not as a villain, but as a symbol of an era of coaching that may be reaching a crossroads. Because if future stars begin choosing environments where they feel empowered rather than tested, supported rather than scrutinized, the ripple effect could redefine where power lives in women's college basketball. And the wild part is, this entire wave started with a freshman calmly describing her daily reality, without realizing how many people were ready to hear it differently. That's what makes this feel like something that has never happened on YouTube before. Not a scandal, not drama, just perspective changing in real time. A realization spreading that the mental side of college athletics might be the next frontier of evolution in the sport. And that realization is making people rewatch everything. Reconsider everything, rethink everything. Because once you start asking how players feel instead of how they perform, the game looks completely different. And that's where this story leaves us, not with accusations, not with answers, but with a question that feels bigger than one program, one coach, or one player. What does excellence need to look like in the next era of women's basketball? And can the old blueprint survive in a world where athletes are no longer willing to separate greatness from well-being? What happens next is the part no one can quite predict, because it doesn't unfold in press conferences or box scores. It unfolds in living rooms, in quiet conversations between parents and daughters, between recruits and high school coaches, between players and the people they trust when the cameras are off. The question being asked in those rooms is no longer just, can she play there? It's, what will it feel like for her to live there? That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. For decades, the appeal of the UConn Huskies women's basketball was simple and powerful. Go there, work harder than you've ever worked, and you'll come out ready for the pros. The track record backed it up. The banners, the draft picks, the legends who passed through the program, proof that the formula worked. But now, recruits are looking at the formula itself. They're asking whether the emotional cost described so calmly by Sarah Strong is something they want to sign up for before they ever step on campus. And for the first time in a long time, the answer might not automatically be yes. Not because they doubt the coaching of Geno Auriemma, not because they doubt the program's history, but because they're weighing something previous generations rarely had the language to articulate: the daily mental experience of being inside that system. That's the part this moment unlocked. It gave recruits and families a way to talk about something that used to be invisible. Before, the conversation was about minutes, roles, championships, exposure. Now, it includes tone, communication style, emotional climate, and personal fit. And that kind of conversation travels fast through AAU circuits, group chats, and recruiting visits. It doesn't take a public controversy to shift perception. It takes a few honest sentences from someone living it. Because honesty from the inside carries a different weight than speculation from the outside. What's fascinating is that this isn't happening loudly. There are no dramatic headlines from the program, no fiery responses, no back and forth. Everything on the surface still looks like it always has in stores. Practices run, games are played, corrections are made in real time. Standards remain sky high, but beneath that surface, awareness has changed. And awareness, once introduced, never really goes away. Players coming into the program now do so with eyes a little more open. They've seen the clip. They've heard the discussion. They know what the environment feels like before they arrive. That changes how they interpret it when they experience it firsthand. What might have once felt shocking now feels expected. What might have once felt personal now feels structural. And that difference could determine how they respond emotionally to the same coaching style that built decades of success. Because when you know something is coming, you prepare differently. You brace differently. You process it differently. That's the quiet evolution happening in real time. And it extends beyond recruits. Current players inside the program are aware of the conversation too. They're aware that the outside world is looking at their experiences through a new lens. That changes how they understand their own feelings. It gives them permission to interpret pressure in ways they might not have before. Not as weakness, but as something worth acknowledging. That's powerful, because acknowledgement is often the first step toward change, even if that change is gradual and invisible. The larger women's basketball world is watching closely, not because they expect UConn to crumble, but because they sense that something foundational is being reconsidered across the sport. The era where toughness was defined by how much you could endure without speaking is fading. A new era is emerging where toughness includes knowing when to speak honestly about what something feels like. Strong didn't criticize, she didn't accuse, but her honesty modeled something that may prove just as influential as any play she makes on the court. She showed that you can respect a system and still describe its weight. And that balance is what's resonating everywhere, because this isn't about tearing anything down. It's about asking whether the next generation can build greatness in a way that feels different from the last. That question sits quietly at the heart of every practice now, every recruiting visit, every sideline moment that gets clipped and shared online. Not because anyone is looking for problems, but because people are curious whether evolution is possible without sacrificing excellence. Can a program known for relentless correction find ways to pair that with emotional breathing room? Can a culture built on constant evaluation also create space for players to feel human, not just accountable? Can standards remain sky high while the experience of meeting them feels less like pressure and more like partnership? Those are the questions swirling around this moment, and they don't have easy answers. Because what made UConn great is deeply tied to the very intensity now being re-examined. That's the paradox. The thing that built the dynasty might be the very thing the next generation wants to experience differently. And navigating that paradox will require more than adjustments on the court. It will require reflection off it. The fascinating part is that this entire conversation remains respectful. There's no outrage, no scandal, no call for change shouted from rooftops. Just thoughtful observations spreading through the sport like a slow ripple. That's why it feels so different. It's not driven by emotion, it's driven by awareness. It's not driven by emotion, it's driven by awareness. And awareness is hard to argue with, because it comes from listening instead of accusing. As this awareness grows, the real impact may not show up in headlines but in choices, in where recruits go, in how coaches across the country adjust their communication, in how players talk about their experiences publicly and privately. The legacy of this moment may not be tied to any single outcome. It may simply be remembered as the point when women's basketball collectively started caring as much about how players feel as how they perform. And that shift, once it takes hold, reshapes everything. Because when athletes feel seen, they expect to be heard. When they're heard, they expect environments that respond. And when environments respond, the entire culture evolves. That's where this story leaves us now, at the edge of something changing quietly but meaningfully. Not because of drama, not because of controversy, but because a freshman described her reality with enough clarity that the entire sport paused to listen. If this conversation made you see women's college basketball a little differently, you're not alone. Because this isn't just about one interview, one player, or one program. It's about the future of the sport and the kind of environments the next generation of stars will choose to grow in. It's about understanding what excellence really costs and whether that cost has to look the same moving forward. So now, we want to hear from you. Do you think the pressure described inside the UConn Huskies women's basketball is the reason for its greatness? Or do you think women's basketball is entering an era where elite performance and emotional well-being can finally exist side by side? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This is a conversation the entire basketball world is having quietly. Let's have it out loud. If you learned something new from Sarah Strong's perspective, share this with someone who loves the game. The more people understand what players actually experience behind the scenes, the better the sport becomes for everyone watching and everyone playing. And if you want more deep, real conversations about women's basketball, recruiting, WNBA pathways, and the stories you won't hear in highlight reels, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the game is evolving, the culture is evolving, and you're watching it happen in real time.